Okay, so welcome to the Claigan webinar, RoHS Changes in 2025. I'm Bruce Calder, I'm the VP Consulting Services here at Claigan, and I'll be your host today. So major changes to RoHS. Let's start off with the details. So the big changes coming is there's new RoHS exemptions. These changes, which have been proposed, kind of in the works, not really in the works, threatened, whichever, since about 2022, are now actually coming to fruition. So this basically changes to all the major RoHS exemptions, all the ones you're used to using: lead and steel, lead and aluminum, lead and copper, lead and high temp solder, lead and glass, the magical 7C1, and the international RoHS technical documentation standards being updated. People go, oh, they're updating the due diligence standard. There is no due diligence standard for RoHS. Due diligence is not an RoHS word, by the way. It's a UK term, which left the EU and the UK left. RoHS is technical documentation and proportionality. Due diligence is what a salesman says to try to sell it to your boss because they think they'll understand it, but that's actually not what's used here. Conflict minerals is due diligence. Battery regulation actually is due diligence. RoHS does not. It's technical documentation. So they're updating the international technical documentation standard under pressure from both the EU and China to include mandatory testing of high-risk parts. So it's basically mandated by EU and China. I'll explain it. That's the other big change coming. They're basically saying, look, it's always been there in the technical documentation law, the standard is supposed to mirror. It says include in your technical documentation test reports if applicable. If applicable doesn't mean if you want to do it. No, it means if you have a part that could fail and there is a test for it, you have to test. That's what it means. Overview in the agenda. By the way, a little cartoon there, some Scott Metzger. In this day and age, all the fun stuff going on in the news, always good. Definitely worth, whatever you're on, worth a follow or a calendar. It's just a little more enjoying. But definitely, it's dogs and cats. Definitely like my dog, definitely like my cats. The dog that loves me very much, my cats less so. So very much along that lines. So we're gonna do a lot of chemistry today. So it's always good to have a little bit of dogs and cats cartoons. So we're gonna talk about the new RoHS exemptions after I talk a tiny bit about us. There will be some dogs and cats cartoons though. The new RoHS exemptions, the exemption timelines, because they're not, unless you're deep into this kind of thing and you speak, RoHS exemption, it may not make the most sense in the world. So, okay, try to put it in, simpler terms. And then the update to the RoHS technical documentation, the international standard, what's going on, the changes in China RoHS, which are both related to technical documentation and some other changes, the new table, so on and so forth. And of course, one of the things in the technical documentation we'll talk about is you only have to test high-risk parts. There is a provision in IEC 62321-2 on determining what high-risk parts. There's an example high-risk parts table. It's not that great. It's out of date, but the concept is good. So we've produced our own. This is based on 100,000 parts of data. It's real data, not just one person hypothesizing. Any part can fail for RoHS. You can add lead to anything in any way you could imagine. But in reality, this is based on what we're actually testing. These are the failures we're seeing from products from all over the world. And then Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to sit it in the control panel, in the Q&A panel. I'll try to get to as many as possible. If I don't get to yours, just feel free to reach out and I'll try to get to it. Okay, so what do we do? Claigan Environmental. Claigan, sign right there. We prevent ADHD, we prevent cancer, and we trace tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold to the conflict minerals to the warlords in the Congo. So did a lot of people on this call, actually. When you're working on DHP, or banned substance, DHP, that's the main cause of attention deficit. Weight leaks out and you ingest it. Comes right off in your hands, actually. Prevent cancer, lead, cadmium, and of course, conflict minerals. And so when I try to explain, DHP, what we do, people get blank. If I mention PFAS, people think they know what we do, but they don't. Oh, you mean like the bad Teflon pans? I'm like, Teflon pans aren't bad. Interesting thing, if you ever get bored or what, when if I go to like one of the US states, like Minnesota or Maine, they say, hey, we have this problem because, we have this PFAS coming off products and getting into people. I'm like, okay, show me the water testing data. Cool, I can see from the data. Here's the Google Maps. This is your problem. And not your frying pan. So a lot of we do in this case, we're doing more advocacy than we used to. We may create a group to follow and support the RoHS exemptions timeline because it's not trivial. For a lot of the complex products, you probably have less interest contributing than actually know what's going on. So we might actually do that. Okay, so what do? We do a lot of consulting like this. What are your products? What do you do? What are the regulations? What do you actually have to do? And we're very much output focused. You'll see that in a moment where we always look at, okay, this is really cool. What's the output? Sweet. Okay, what's the best way to get there? But half what we do is testing. They go hand in hand. I don't understand anybody doing consulting without testing arm because you don't really know of any reality. And testing is very helpful in consulting. It gives us a lot of better specific knowledge, not to come in blind, but to come in very output focused. So it's a really good match. And it leads into the core thing. The declaration reporting, the output, the declaration conformity, the PFAS report, Canadian PFAS reporting, the Section 71 report, TSCA report, your WE report, your skip file. That's really what you're targeting. And there's usually a better way to get there. I always love the tons of data gathering. I see the skip file. I'm like, that's totally wrong. They don't have those SPHCs, and there's missing ones they do have. And I can tell in a moment. I personally hate full material declaration, mostly because people don't understand chemistry declarations, what the rules are for safety data sheet. They say, well, you get off the safety data sheet that has all the chemicals. I'm like, safety data sheet is for the worker safety of the user of the chemical or powder. It's actually not built to make FMDs. There's a lot of data missing there. Like most of the new restricted substances aren't even listed there. Anything new, more times than not, it won't be in the SDS. And any full material declaration won't have it. And I always like looking at full material declarations and laughing, knowing what I can see. I can tell in seconds the mistake. Now, that said, I've seen a few good ones recently, but these are like microchip level parts. The other problem is most of your baseline products, what goes into them is not what the final product is. They're quite different. And polymer chemistry is not for everybody. Okay, so we've been also doing RoHS since 2003, at least I have. We've been around since 2010. Goodness, 15 years now. But I've been doing this for a lot longer. My hair color shows. Fortunately, it's mostly there. I might be doing a little Friar Tuck in the back. I'm trying not to, but mostly just gray hair. Also, in the RoHS, I'm talking about the new stuff, the changes. If you want to do the basics, we do have a YouTube channel. We do lunch and learns for people internally. So when we teach things internally, we get food, and people come for food, especially boys. And then we teach them something. So we decided late last year, why don't we actually start recording what we're teaching? And so we did the ultimate primer for EU RoHS. It's got a lot more of the basics, background. If you understand the background, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today actually makes a lot more sense. You're like, why is it this way? Well, it's because the way the way it was built. And so this builds a lot of the baseline structures. And so it's on our YouTube channel. A lot of people have been watching our YouTube stuff. It's actually been very flattering. So their primer. So we're doing another one next week, I believe, on REACH, mostly for articles. So we're talking REACH SPHCs and REACH restrictions primarily. I should be recording that next week if I don't screw it up completely or forget to hit the record button, which unfortunately has happened. Sorry, Emma. And that we should have it up in about a week and a half. It should have sort of the same ultimate primer, lunch and learn for EU REACH. So that's more the basics. Today, we're talking about the changes. So it helps if you know the basics, understand the changes. I should probably get to the topic. I'm kind of blathering along, but I'm just going to do cat cartoons first because this is definitely my cat. And really, it kind of suggests I really should be getting going here. So on to the main topic, new RoHS exemptions. So they're not really that new. They were actually proposed by OICO, the consultant, in 2022. The actual proposals have been existing for 3 years. And a lot of people, especially last year, got really confused. We got phone calls. I got phone calls every other day, especially in the middle of the year, that, oh my goodness, the exemptions are going away July 2024. I'm like, no, that was in 2022. The consultant made a suggestion to the EU Commission that they never adopted until it actually becomes EU law. It's just a suggestion. And it's not going to be that. Eventually, someday, I keep telling people, they're going to actually propose real ones. And they're going to go up for consultation called the Have Your Say, real name. By the way, if you want to keep track of things in the EU new legislation, just sign up for the Have Your Say. You'll get some crazy things. My favorite this week, actually spectacular. I recommend it for everybody. You're like, you're recommending EU legislation. I'm like, yeah, wait for this. They actually, they mapped out their plan for protecting consumers in 2025 and beyond. In that, the basis of it is one of the main key parts of it is the dark patterns by online retailers. And they have an incredible study, which is very detailed, explains all the dark patterns, all the deceptive schemes used by most retailers. It's phenomenal. It was in your Have Your Say consultation and about their 2025 and beyond plan, but there's a whole basis, and it's the whole psychological approach to Roach, Roach Motel and pre-selection and all these terms. It explains things you see every day. So I just went for a little wander there, but I recommend anybody keeping up EU legislation to sign up for the Have Your Say consultation. Sounds kind of corny, but it's pretty well everything that's coming comes through there. It's pretty good. So as I said, basically, since 2022, it's like eventually it's going to appear suddenly as a Have Your Say consultation, which it did at the very end of last year. And that's the real one. And so that's what appeared. The current status, it appeared in Have Your Say consultation, which it ended in February 10th. So that part's done, like Monday. You guys should read all the comments down below it. It's really exciting. So they did 6A, B, C, which 6A really should have been lead and aluminum. It's lead and steel. It's kind of a whole opportunity missed, I think. We're having to deal with like a decade of 6A, B, steel, not aluminum. It's kind of irritating. 6C is lead and copper. That makes sense. 6B is lead and aluminum. It probably would be a little more convenient if 6A is aluminum. But a lot of major exemptions, there's a link there. Anytime you see a little blue or purplish, is it blue or purple? I'm not really good with colors. So this pink, salmon, I'm not really sure. 7A is the high temp solder one used in pretty well all electronics. You plug into the wall, there's going to be a cutoff diode with it, at least inside the power supply, if not many other places. And 7C1, which is probably one of the most plentiful. It's lead and glass and electronics. It's either usually resistive elements like thick film resistors, but a few other things. And then it's a whole different technology. It's the piezoelectric materials like buzzers and actuators. Very, very different usage. And they're getting split. So they're both continuing, but they're getting split. And that one actually makes some sense because lead and glass and lead and piezo materials are two very different things. And they're both useful and have needs, but they're very different streams. So you can go to the actual consultations there. I'm going to explain a lot of details around it. So I'm going to take lead in aluminum for machining purposes. So if you see an expiry date that has months in it, that's an expiry date. It's going away. So this one will disappear 18 months after entry into force. So imagine that the final version is published in May of this year. That means it expires 18 months from May, October, November-ish. November in 2026. That's a real one. So when it says months, that's a real expiry. It's going away. If it has a date, like this one still has, for a lot of historical reasons, you have to read the primer to watch the primer to understand why this is all kind of skewed. If it has a date, like 31st December 2026, that's an expiry in absence of renewal. That means a renewal can still be had. So if you see a date, it can still be renewed as long as the renewal is applied for 18 months in advance. So say June 2025. It will, if nobody applies for renewal, it will expire December 2026. Now, the Category 9 professional control monitoring could apply for renewal, but they won't get it as this. They have to be much more specific. Like it could be a lead and alloying element for machined aluminum in like steering wheel, car steering wheels, or something very specific, and that's a maybe. Note, Category 8 never actually got this exemption. It's a long story. They went straight to 6B3. So everybody's like, oh my goodness, then it means I'm already expired for medical. It actually is for machined. So machined aluminum for medical actually goes away in 12 months. It's a bit of an error. It really should be 18. I'm not sure how they're going to handle that. They basically made a text error, I think, in the consultation that got mentioned, hopefully. So it really should be 18 for everybody. You notice that it says 18 months from entry to force from categories 1 to 7 and 10. Yeah, they forgot 8, medical. And if you look at everything, medical loses this in 12 months instead of 18 months. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be 18 months for everybody. So in practice, that's just a bit of a text error. Not to go into all the detail. So 6B, 6A, lead and steel. It disappears 12 months from publication. It goes away. That means it is like no cap. It expires in 12 months, like no cap. So anybody who's born before 2005, no cap, its translation is for real. So the young people are like, oh, I know what no cap means. And old people like me are like, it means for real. And by the way, young people below 2005, they probably don't know what no cap means. It's like, well, it means like, no BS. No, it actually means no kappa. It's a term from Twitch. It just got simple to no cap. They probably wouldn't know that either. And then if you told them that, they wouldn't be terribly excited by it. And if they get really, really complicated with you, just ask them whether or not the Rizzler and the Costco guy are related. And then you get a whole story that you didn't never go existed and really never really wanted to go exist. Turns out this week I drove a half dozen teenage girls from one place to another. So other things, this I did learn more recently. Because my daughter replies KK. I'm like, why do you go KK? It's like KK is like okay. I'm like, cool, but I just go K. And they're like, no, K is passive aggressive. So I've been passive aggressive in my text all this time, and I go, "Okay, that's passive aggressive." It turns out it should be KK if you're not being passive aggressive. I'm like, okie dokie. Anyways, back to chemistry, which I know a little bit more about. So lead and steel becomes 6A1. Lead and steel for. Now I promised myself when I did this morning I would have fixed the text. It should say for machining, not for machine purposes. Anyways, I'll fix that in the final slides. I promise. Pinky promise. Lead and steel for machining purposes. And it expires the 31st of December, 2026. Now, this is an expiry. With translation, it needs to be, somebody needs to submit it on a renewal before June the 30th, 2025 to continue it on. So because it has a date, 31st of December, it actually has a renewal potential. The actual original 6A does not. It's got 12 months, expires 12 months. Again, months means it's going away. Now, 6A2, lead and steel, hot dip galvanized, which is probably one of the biggest rigged exemptions I've ever seen. When I read it, I know my chemistry, there's a lot of half truths in here. What it is, they're saying when you dip steel into hot dip galvanized zinc, there is some trace unintended, not unintended, completely intended lead in it that gets into the steel. And it's not a coating, it embeds into the material and it becomes part of the homogeneous material, which is not non-uniform homogeneous material. I'm like, sure. If you guys want the exemption, fine, but it's not accidental. If you read the white papers, the lead content in the hot dip galvanized creates properties in the product that you want. So it's their purpose. They say it's unintentional, but it's their purpose. But either way, there's an exemption for it for lead and hot steel galvanized. It also expires December 2026 as a December 2026 expiry, which means it just has to be renewed before June 30th, 2025. So again, it's got a real date. That means renewal is possible. And in both cases, renewal should be possible. The biggest complaint so one of the problems when you do something like this, and if the smart kids go first, which was the 6C copper people, they had a really good explanation of why they need it for machining, and they had data on wear and quality and tool wear and great things. And lead and steel people said, we need it. The consultant's like, fine, we'll give it to you right now, but you really have to explain why. Because it is tricky when you go after the smart kids, and it's like doing a presentation, and smart kids go first. Damn. and then you're judged on that. So hot dip galvanized, it has a basically June 30th, 2025 renewal. Now, if nobody renews these, they do expire in December 2026. So there is a lot of interest to make sure they get renewal. So we may form a group. It's not the most expensive thing to keep everybody up to speed and probably do some submissions. We're more likely going to represent the complex product people that have to use these, that redesigns a problem, as opposed to the actual manufacturers necessarily the individual components, which will bite them too. Okay, RoHS exemptions, 6B, lead and aluminum. This is the one that's going away. So 6B is first going away 12 months from publication, which due to a clerical error kind of means medical gets loose in 12 months because they're not included in the other ones. It's going to be 18. It's not shocking this one's going away because 6B1, which was proposed a long time ago, lead and aluminum for machining purposes, again, typo there, expires 18 months from publication. So this one's gone. Lead machining and aluminum is gone. Translation, it's gone. Except briefly for professional lab gear, lab equipment has the ability of renewal. They won't be successful, but they have the ability to do so. 6B3 is lead and aluminum for cast aluminum. So cast aluminum, because of recycled aluminum, is allowed at still up to 0.3%. It is a December 2026 expiry, which it's not, again, you have to renew it. So it's not really expired. It's got a date. That means a renewal is possible. AL for machining purposes is not possible. So you can actually renew this one. You're like, what about 6B2? It lasted a shorter lifetime than Peter Ostrom's career and about as memorable because you probably don't even remember his career. He was the original Willy Wonka, the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. He eventually retired to be a veterinarian in upstate New York. Yeah, so 6B2, just let it go. It's cast aluminum. There's an interim one. Anyway, 6B3 is the cast aluminum one coil. 6C, lead and copper. It has a 31st of December 2026 expiry. It was written so well originally that it actually has its own renewal. This is the one I guess the smart kids went and they explained very detailed why lead's needed in brass for machining and so on and so forth. Now it's going to become, it has nothing yet. It will need a renewal. It probably needs refinement. So there's a lot of validity to it in lead and machined aluminum and copper, and lead and cast copper, but they're going to have to then probably split it and justify it with new terminology. Instead of being passed on as lead and copper, it's probably lead and copper and machined copper, 6C1, and then lead and copper and cast copper, like 6C2, and some more justification. It has a June 30th, 2025 renewal. This one, there should be a lot more technical detail going on here. Definitely some of the main metals manufacturers have really championed this before and done a fantastic job. But I wouldn't necessarily rely on that every time. It was years ago. Last time they had a champion this was 5 years ago, and the world's different. Okay, so 7A. So that was mostly metals. Now let's get to the main electronics. So 7A is lead and high temp solder. Everybody basically uses it. It's if you plug something in the wall, the power supply has a thermal cutoff diode that uses it, not to mention many other parts. This is lead and high temp solder, which has a December 2026 expiry, which it already has a bunch of sub-exemptions coming, which I'll explain, like 7A1 and 7A2, which means it can actually be renewed. In reality, it can't be renewed. But you can ask for exemptions they missed. So I'm going to talk about lead and high temp solder, which due to a variety of language and other technical things are actually very permissive exemptions. But if they missed yours, which is more common in 7C1, you can still apply for a new one, like lead and high temp solder in, I think the one they missed is piezoelectric actuators and buzzers, unless the ultrasonic, the audio one counts. But basically, when you solder a wire onto a piezo, a disc that buzzes, vibrates, the tin solder is very rigid and fractures. So you have to use high temp lead solder, which is fine now, but it doesn't have an exemption for solder attached to piezo materials. So this becomes 7A1, lead and high temperature solder for die attach, which people might go, okay, and it has a December 2027 expiration, so it's later, so it's a well-justified one. So basically its renewal will be June 2026 deadline. It's different, it's got a little bit later. People might say, but it says lead and high temp solder for internal interconnections for attaching die or other components along with the die and semiconductor assembly with steady state or transient impulse currents of 0.1 amps or greater, or blocking voltage beyond 10 volts, or edge die sizes larger than 0.3 millimeters by 0.3 millimeters. Yes, we have some experts in the Oxford comma. They didn't necessarily put the commas in the right spot, or did they? It's a good question, actually, because they're all separate, and all it matters is it's die attached, and the die is larger than 0.3 millimeters, which is the size of a width of a human hair, which is everything. So it's basically, it can be used in die attach as long as it's for die attach. All this other technical stuff doesn't matter because of the comma placement. Maybe they'll fix it, but right now that's not the way it is. In truth, it and 7A2 are the same part of a chart that was in the original submission. I don't think the consultant necessarily knew they were related to the same thing, and they split them up. And then some other people's requests, which were different, didn't necessarily make it in. So there's a good reason why it has its own separate expiry to fix these problems. So if they missed yours, you can still apply for it. This one is over permissive. That's fine. So it's really lead and high temperature solder for die attach. And then 7A2 is lead and high temperature solder for die attach. You're like, but they're the same. Well, technically they're not, but they are. So it's also got December 2027 expiry. It also is a big wad of text. For integral, meaning internal and external connections of die attach, in electrical electronic components, if all the following conditions are met, the thermal conductivity of the cured sintered die attached material is greater than 35 watts per meter Kelvin. The electric conductivity of the cured sintered die attached material is greater than 4.7 mega Siemens per meter. Now, when I see S, I normally think of sieverts because I deal with radiation all the time, but Siemens. And the solidus melting temperature is higher than 206 degrees Celsius. And you're like, this is a wee bit technical. Yeah, except it's actually sort of the MatWeb definition of 85% lead and higher high temp solder. Those are the physical parameters of high temp solder. So it can be high temp solder as long as it's high temp solder. Okay. But instead of saying it can be high temp solder, if it's high temp solder, it's like it can be high temp solder, and these are actually the parameters of high temp solder, and they put them in as the conditions, but this is the parameters of high temp solder. So, and again, it says connections are die attached. So it's literally you can use high temp solder and die attach as long as it's high temp solder, which means 782 is also lead and high temp solder for die attach. Now, realistically, when they're originally submitted and when I looked at the submission, they're actually in the same table, kind of meant for the same thing. And I don't know why they separated. 100% sure they knew what they were reading. So 71 and 72 are functionally the same thing. One due to errors in commas, and the other one's because all it did is define the physical parameters of high temp solder. 73, lead and multi-phase solder joints. So this is a very logical one. It again expires in 2027. It's the idea is if you solder something into like a die into a package, and then you have to solder that onto something else. When you're soldering the second one, you do reflow, you don't want the temperature to cause the first solder to reflow and break the joint. So the first solder joint, which could be warmed up by the second soldering, has to have a melting point higher than the second one. So as long as it's got to make it so when you use solder, it's going to be only melts at high temperature. So then when you solder the next one at lower temperature, it doesn't affect the first one. So it's basically we do these multi-phase soldering where the first solder can be exposed to the second soldering's heat and cause it to reflow. 74 is lead in electrical connections for hot lamps. There's some other technical things. It's hot lamps. Bit of a simplification, but that's really what it is. If you're in that industry, great. So it's needed really for lamps to get hot, which makes sense because the tin solder can't handle it. And then lead and solder for audio transducers. Does this include piezoelectric transducers? Because buzzers, I think. If it is, because a buzzer needs the lead solder in it. So this is the one, did they miss something here? And I understand why it's there. It basically vibrates and the tin solder is too brittle, no fracture. That's why you need the lead solder. And so are all the piezoelectric uses here? I'm not sure. That's really up to their industry. But I definitely recommend they check that out. Is this the buzzer? That's an audio transducer, fine. But all the other piezo actuator type functions. So again, that's a 2027, which means they have to be renewed by June 2026. It's a little bit later. It's got a little more time than the metals do. So that's 7A, which has got a whole bunch of new variants. And you can still apply for more. You have until June of this year to apply for something that was missed. 7C1 is the most common, probably. Exemption is one in thick film resistors, amongst a couple other uses. So it really covers lead in glass and lead in piezo materials. It's got two very different technologies. It's also got December 31st, 2026 expiry. So if they missed yours, like they have lead in glass for sealing purposes, but does that include the actual lead in glass in the lid? That's related, probably. But if it's missing that, you can still apply for it, which means it has really a June 30th, 2025 renewal. You won't get the whole thing renewed. You have to say, I need 7C1 lead in glass electronics for, the lead in glass lid when I seal ceramic to or glass to metal. It needs its own, might need its own entry, but you still can. You still have to June of this year. And so basically it can be renewed, but it can't really be renewed, but you can actually, technically it could, but it won't be. But you can pick up or request exemptions that were missed, that were originally covered by 7C1, still until June of this year. So this becomes 7C5. You're like, what happened to 2 and 3 and 4? They've already existed. Those are all lead in ceramics, capacitor stuff. That's already been handled. They have their own. 7C4 is lead in glass in. I swear I get the feeling that whoever wrote this one was different than the 7A person, which is different than the 6ABC person. Because instead of making a 6C6, which I actually don't mind this approach, what they really did is they create a lead in glass exemption and a lead in piezo material, which is great. So under the lead in glass, they have lead borate electrical insulation of high voltage diodes. Okie dokie. Lead in glass and hermetic sealing between glass and metal parts. Glass doesn't seal well to metal without lead there. For bonding at glass transition temperatures, not 100% sure what that's for, but there it is. For resistive elements, this is the main one. This is the resistor one. This is the thick film resistor one. That's kind of important, very, very common. And then for chemically modified glass surfaces. A lot of times glass seems to need it for some kind of adhesion, but they all put these all under 7C5. Kind of made sense. I was pretty sure they're going to go lead in glass one way, lead in piezo another way. They're two different material sets. But they're kind of all squished together with the December 2027 expiry, which means a 2026 renewal. Again, if they missed yours under these, because they're kind of being a little specific and they may not have understood all the differences, you still have till June of this year to apply for additional ones. And it is lead and piezo and PTC materials, which makes sense. The piezo, lead zirconate titanate is very different than lead and glass. They're very different material sets. And this is the December 2027 expiry. The piezo needs it. It's lead zirconate titanate of all materials. So it just needs to be renewed again. See, that was easy. 7C1, very easy. Not really. So basically, most of the uses you have for continuing. However, a lot of the use of lead and glass, when you see 7C1, other than resistors, are really complicated. And you'll often need your component supplier to figure that stuff out. The main user who puts the component in the product may have no idea. It's a very complicated thing. So 7C1 is getting 7C5 and 7C6 with a non-suicide clause saying until June of this year, you can also renew for something we missed. So to recap our RoHS exemptions. Today, consultation ended, or really Monday, the RoHS exemptions. May, roughly, is when they've been public. They can do it earlier. I'm just being a little bit sandbaggish. They have been earlier in some other things. It might be as early as March. This is a scientific wild ass guess. This is a slang term meaning rough estimate made by an expert in the field, me, based on experience and intuition. It actually might be a bit earlier. Let's go with May. It's basically that 12 months or 18 months can trigger off that publication date. Let's go with May for this example. June 2025 is the deadline for most of the metal renewals. The solder ones are 2026. May 2026 is when 6A and B go the way of the dodos. That's when the main ones. Now, 6, and that's the way machined aluminum is going too. The new cast aluminum continue on is fine. The 6A machined lead and machine steels continuing, but the original ones have expired 12 months, so they're going away. 18 months for machined, which is another November 2026. That's so this is the first one of the ones that say months to expiry going away. And June 2026 is really the deadline for renewal of slam dunk exemptions. So this is like the lead and high temp solder. There's a really good reason why it's there. I think a slam dunk exemption, it's already very specific. It's for die attach. They might have to fix the language, like the commas, and the fact that 7A1 and 7A2 are the same exemption once you get past all the gobbledygook. But it basically is another renewal in June. So the ones that are December 2027 have a June 2026 renewal. The ones that December 2026 have a June 2025 renewal. So the key renewal date for the first one is really June 2025. Nice and complicated. Now update to the RoHS technical documentation standard, IEC 63000, which is the renaming of the original EN 50581. The original technical documentation standard was EU specific. They wanted a more generalized one internationally. They changed like 4 words, maybe 3 words in it, if that, and they call it the IEC standard, 63000. So that's the technical documentation standard for all RoHS. It's being changed to align with global requests. I mean, there's going to be some resistance, but the EU and China are pretty specific. So the EU put an official request in the EU Commission Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Enterprise, and SMEs, and said to update RoHS compliance standard, identify that testing data is mandatory for an RoHS technical file. There's a section in the law that says, the actual law says you have to include test reports if applicable. If applicable doesn't mean if you did it. It means if it's a testable thing and it could fail that test, then you have to do it. The text of the request is there. There are also, one of the big reasons is like companies were just gathering data, supplier data was wrong a good portion of the time. They blame the supplier. The EU can only find out by paying the money to test themselves. They're like, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be done. You're the one making the money of that product under your brand. You're responsible for compliance, not us. We're just here to double check in general the compliance level. And they double checked it and they went, the RoHS compliance level is horrid. So you guys are not doing enough and you're going to have to test. And that's what we wrote here originally. China RoHS already has now, not already, in their new standard, they have mandatory testing for the catalog products, the products that are under the restrictions. Most products only have to do the table in China, which is changing too, by the way. But it's mandatory testing for catalog products. So when declaring conformity with the restrictions of the use of hazardous substances in electrical and electronic products, a requirement has been added for technical supporting documentation, IEC 63000, to include test reports covering high-risk components containing hazardous substances. This aims to enhance the overall credibility of the RoHS self-declaration conformity assessment results within the industry. So it's mandatory. Now, the RoHS standard, why are they doing it? It's to align the standard with the law. The law is Decision 768/2008. It says you have to do test reports, and people haven't because it says if applicable. They're like, that's not what if applicable means. So the current standard does not meet the EU's conformity assessment requirements. So it's out. The standard is out of compliance with the law. And they also said the revised standard shall reflect the generally acknowledged state of the art. When 50581 was made like 15 years ago, testing was still in its infancy and often more involved. Now it's really simple. With the advent of the direct mass spec, where you can test directly for phthalates and flame retardants, it's like XRF screening, but a little more difficult. It's not XRF, it's mass spec, but you can do it directly without complex sample prep. It's a different world now. It's actually easier than data gathering. Testing for RoHS has matured greatly since the original EN 50581. That's basically saying it's a different world now. It's really easy to do. However, you only have to, I'll mention in a moment, the parts that can fail, which is less now. So that's also the acknowledged state. So key points. If it can be tested and a non-compliance is possible, it should be tested. Really, it's if there's a risk of it. So you can have a non-compliance in anything. You can slap lead on anything. One of the most common leads we see is the packaging, the clamshell, a plastic clamshell, which is impossible to open. Lead or cadmium is often used to stabilize the packaging. Now, that's not under RoHS because it's packaging, but it is under the packaging directive. Which, by the way, there's a new packaging regulation as of basically last week. Most things don't really kick in until 2028, so that's why I'm not really hurrying the webinar. But you got lots to do. But if a non-compliance is possible, it should be tested. And the EU body's got 32 months to update. However, the international one will have to do it first because the international one gets the IC standard. So it gets done first and then goes to the EU one. And it's a pretty easy update. Now, in the RoHS standard update, risk assessment for testing is allowed. It's actually in IEC 62321-2. And in the Chinese one and the European one, if there's a risk of non-compliance, it has to be tested if there's a test. There's a chart in IEC 62321-2 on how to do risking. It's indicative as opposed to mandatory. It's not fantastic. The idea is good, but it's got low, medium, and high. What's medium? Like if this is around whether we have to do something or not have to do something, it should be low, don't have to do something, high, have to do something, medium, don't know what that means unless you put criteria. And their risks are not exactly up to snuff with the modern stuff. So it's allowed, but outdated. So we built another one. This is much more modern, and one of the nice things being consultant and test lab is we have access to a lot of real data, like 2024 data, 2025 data. So we've got a high risk table. We expect to release it this week. We're very likely will include a link with the mailer when it goes out. You can download it yourself. High risk components table this week, and it's much more comprehensive. It's based on 2023 and 2024 actual test data. So not theoretical, not everybody copy pasting each other, which is a problem for a lot of these regulations. And it's probably the bugaboo of PFAS is one government copying another government's data from years ago. This is modern. So the guidance table is to supplement the IC 63,000 conformity assessment. Again, if it's not high risk, you don't have to test it. The testing itself, picking and choosing parts, and China RoHS, which allows risk assessment. Also, there's actually a table about it in the new China RoHS standard. And it's based on 2 years of test data, 2023 and 2024. It's about 100,000 parts. So it's very comprehensive. And it's basically, did we ever get a failure for that in this period? No, low risk. That's a huge amount of parts. So the risk identifiers, if it says yes, that means we've had a part of this type fail in the past 2 years. So it's high risk. Now, we do have some rules down at the bottom about repeat testing, where basically we've tested the same type of component, this many times. So we have to keep testing it. And a bunch of rules, no, you don't. Over the 2 years of data, we never found RoHS failure. So it's low risk. It's no. So you don't have to do anything. An RoHS risk, no. And then there are the ones that are exemptions. These are ones that never failed for us in a 2 year period, but they do have exemptions which may change. So we identify them differently because companies often want to identify their exemptions because they might change, and we just talked about earlier. So if it's an EX, it means it hasn't ever failed, or not in these 2 years. But that does have an exemption in commonly used, which is probably one of the reasons why it doesn't fail. So the high risk table has circuit board components, huge number, yes, no, exemption, et cetera. It's a big, long, quite varied. It's funny, like PVC capacitor wrap fails. often enough. Wire fails often enough. But the yellow wrap around a transformer never does, and so on and so forth. Metal components, the frame, does it fail? According to 62321-2, it doesn't, but it does. Not very often, but it does. Fasteners, yes. Colored plastic all the time. Lead is a very common colorant, as is cadmium. Transparent plastic all the time as a stabilizer. Very common RoHS failure. White plastics, no, white plastic never fail. It's funny, colored plastic does, white plastic, transparent plastic do, white plastic does not. Black plastic does, white plastic doesn't, like mechanical components. And so connectors are covered separately, etc. Wiring, miscellaneous components, tubing, neoprene fabric fails all the time. Cotton fabric doesn't. Fluoropolymers don't. Silicone, no. Silicone has a SVHC in it. Every silicone has an SVHC. They're like, well, no, they didn't declare. No, it has the SVHC, just whether over 1,000 ppm. Literally, nice thing about the direct mass spec, we can test for the D4, D5, D6, and silicone like that. They all have it. Every silicone piece has D6 in it, but not necessarily non-compliant level, not 1,000 ppm. But everyone has it. It's just a matter how much got cured. And also rules around repetitive components. Like if you keep testing, you tested solder on a board once, you have to keep testing all solder. We tested solder and lead on a board, you have to keep testing it, no. And so on and so forth. So also, like once you've tested 500 components, if we keep testing, are we going to find any new failures? No. Any failure you're going to find, you've already caught, as long as you've done a good sampling plan. So, and this is definitely for huge products. I mean, but you can do less than 500. They're you can probably justify that too. But 500 is a very good, very comprehensive. We definitely have big data sets saying once you get to 500, you're not going to find anything new as long as you sample properly. So it makes your product size of a desk. You don't have to get carried away here. The idea is to be a little more reasonable. And of course, this applies to things like refrigerators and laptops. Laptops are extremely dense products. You can be quite reasonable about the whole thing. So again, we should release it this week. It's based on 2023 and 2024 test data. Very comprehensive. Now, again, for the new RoHS technical documentation, the plan is for new designs, new, test for RoHS, leverage our risk table. It just makes these we do it automatically internally, and preferably with other regulations. Just get it all done. We found out testing is so much easier to maintain because once you've done it, you have this huge data set that makes next year. So like triphenyl phosphate, the most common SVHC of all time appeared last November. Awesome. It's in flame retardant plastic with phosphorus in it. What parts do we get phosphorus in it? Those 8. Okay, let's just focus on those 8. Let's not worry about the whole product. Don't kill yourself. Well, we can do this 6-month data gathering plan where all our suppliers won't be up to speed anyways. TPP, triphenyl phosphate, it's the most common SVHC of all time. It's there in most products, just how often. But if you've done the testing right, it's only ones with phosphorus. No phosphorus, no triphenyl phosphate. This is really easy. And so we find maintenance so much easier. Oral products, plan to test in the future. Usually when another testing opportunity arrives, like we're doing RoHS testing, especially the new direct mass spec, is so incremental compared to anything else. Included when a new regulation arrives, like PFAS or new REACH restriction, new POP restriction, especially if you're picking high risk ones to do for those. And we're looking, risk restriction is a bigger deal than a declarable because it's more of thou shall not have. And legacy products, just plan it in. And we find updates. Once we got testing baseline of your product, keeping it up to date is pretty easy. And definitely in testing, whatever cost it is this year, it's a quarter of the cost next year. So it's not like your data gathering, it's the same blooming, large, huge cost every year. That isn't very truthful and doesn't usually give you the output. When we look at skip files from data gathering, we're like, By the way, if you're a medical device, really exciting. If you do an MDR submission, they'll look at your skip file. A skip file is actually mandatory for MDR submission. They're like, well, no, it isn't. Like, yes, it is actually, because they look at 23S and see all the warnings you're supposed to have, which is skip, and they'll go through your skip file and ask how you ensure the patient and the worker are not exposed or get proper warnings to it. Skip is actually part of MDR. Indirectly, but in all practical purposes, it very much is. Your notified body will ask for your skip file and ask how, in each of the substances, you've managed the risk to the worker and the patient. But back to RoHS. China RoHS, new table. Now, this one's in English. Obviously, it's going to be Chinese. You can do Chinese and English, but obviously it has to be Chinese. for obviously it's China. Fair enough. A little weird. It's got 10 substances now, which is fine. It makes sense to me. It's just you can put the substances in any order, which seems a little inconvenient for the user, but put them in any order. I think repetition would be probably a better idea, but you can do it in any order. It has to be Chinese. So if you're designing a new product and you don't want to have to redo your IFU in a year, so this is not published, but it is. So this is the final part of the consultation. You want to do the China RoHS table, not the old one. Otherwise, you're going to have to redo your IFU in a year anyways. So it's probably implemented in 2026, maybe 2027, but there's a new table en route. So just so you know, so much we talked about technical file and exemptions. The China RoHS table, which is the China RoHS for most of you guys, is a new one. It's also clarifies a lot of the things we've been doing for years about what component types can be merged together instead of making your life overly complicated, which is what we've done. Not the overly complicated, the merging since day one. It's basically the rules and instructions now are very intelligent and they follow along what we do. There is mandatory testing in RoHS for China RoHS for the catalog products, about 10 products that have restrictions, although everybody else's products don't. They just have to do that table we just talked about. So basically, when declaring conformity with restrictions to the use of hazardous subs of electronic products, the ones in the catalog, there will be more catalogs, but right now it's like washer and dryers and laptops and cell phones. A requirement has been added for technical supporting documents to include test reports covering high-risk components containing hazardous substances. This aims to enhance the overall credibility of the RoHS self-declaration conformity assessment results within the industry. And you also realize that a lot of people who have to write these are cell phone people, laptop people who write the standards have to do it already. So they're not terribly keen on you not having to do it. They want everybody to be in the same playing field. There is more stuff in our China RoHS. Gives you an idea of expectations. During normal production, type testing shall be carried at least once a year. So they have to do it once a year. This is not the EU version. But also must be carried out in the following circumstances. When a new product is finalized, new design, when they're manufactured at a different place, or when requested by them, which kind of makes sense. This is a real thing. This is an international thing. It's everywhere where RoHS are real. UAE RoHS already has the critical component testing. It's everywhere. So a lot of people are going to go through different stages of grieving. There's going to be denial, anger, definitely bargaining, but eventually acceptance might kick in. So there is a lot of that. Depression might be in there too. Hopefully you guys skip right past the anger and depression phase, but you know, never know. And they actually list, again, they have an idea what the high-risk parts are. They do comment, like 62321 kind of is their test standard, so you can use it. So the table structure we're publishing covers all of this and makes it a lot easier for things like refrigerators and washing machines and printers and all that kind of stuff. So these are the ones that are actually under the restrictions, but you can see what they mean by high-risk components. You know, circuit board, PCBA, circuit board components, thermal insulating materials, tapes, cables, compressor components, display components. They're all higher risk, and they're actually kind of right there. I put a lot of like the metal parts are actually quite high risk, but sealant tapes and seals, yes, the rubbers are commonly phthalated or leaded. It's pretty common. So again, our table, we should be publishing this week. Hopefully the mailer will have a link to it. Based on 2023 and 2024 test data. Major change to RoHS again, new RoHS exemptions, changes to all the major RoHS exemption, which we went over at the start. And the International RoHS technical documentation standards being updated to include mandatory testing of high-risk parts. Again, if a part doesn't present a risk, you don't have to test it. Mandated by both the EU and China, where RoHS already exists, except for the UAE, which already has mandatory testing of high-risk parts. Just so we don't forget, a little diversion. I talked about this triphenyl phosphate. There's an off-schedule orphan SVHC last November. Long story how that happened. But it's the most common SVHC in electronics ever. And that's a big deal because of another change. REACH SVHCs are part of your environmental, social, and governance ratings, a little bit in the US. And so this is like Panasonic's one, and chemical safety right there, that's 70%. SVHCs are 70% of the weight of that one right there. And by the way, that's conflict minerals. Anybody working for us in conflict minerals would be in the green side. We're definitely leaders in it. So there's the chemical safety REACH SVHC. That's the US side. The US side is not regulated the same way as the European side. So this is brand new. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which people have heard about. REACH SVHC, REACH restrictions, and POP, not RoHS, are part of the corporate disclosures in the EU for both publicly and privately traded companies, privately held companies. It's right there. It's disclosure requirement E2 5, substance of concern and substance of very high concern. Now, the accountants will say, or the management will say, and lawyers will say, it has to be material, and there's double materiality in the EU. You're like, okay, what does that mean? It means it either has to be you could poison people or the environment with these substances of concern, which a lot of industrials will say, no, we can't, they're keeping our product. Or if you don't comply with these restrictions, you can't sell your product. You're like, ooh, that's neat. REACH restrictions are a big deal. POP restrictions, if I don't comply, I can't sell. Yeah, therefore they're material and they're part of your CSRD reporting for 2025 and beyond. So if people are doing CSRD, now the nice thing for people on this call, this does expand your horizons. I mean, some people might like to be back in their little room with their red stapler and not, involve yourself in new things, but this does open a bigger world for you. The ESG is not going away, no matter what other complexities are going on in the world right now. Definitely corporate level. When we talk to our counterparts like yourselves at a lot of companies, they talk about, I got this investor question about this, or PFAS, or about substance of concern. PFAS are also in this group. There's a way to handle this. One of the ways we handle it right now is really good, especially if you've done data gathering for SCIP. Your SCIP files are over declaring junk. One of the things to do is we go through a little properly, maybe a little select testing, just to prove our point, and be able to reduce the number of declared SVHCs. So you can say in your annual report, we've actually reduced our declarable SVHCs by 50% year over year by doing testing and data work and all these great things. We're mostly just cleaned up the junk you got originally in data gathering. And that's a really good. And then it probably even your salespeople probably even use it saying, hey, we've reduced our substance of concern by 50% last year, or 20% or whatever. And it's mostly just cleaning up what you did the first year. There's a lot of advantages. And again, it enters you into a bigger world, which hopefully means you get a bigger budget, or you get to try new things. And some people are not necessarily big into new things, or some people just got stuck on their job and they necessarily want it full time. But this is just an interesting part. So again, we should be releasing our high-risk components table. We're just doing some quality control. We'll probably do it every year. We're probably releasing it this week. Major changes are RoHS again. RoHS exemptions have changed, and the international technical documentation standards being updated to include mandatory testing for high-risk parts, mandated by both the EU and China. So I'm going to have a Q&A second. Anybody who's registered will receive a copy of the slides. There should be a YouTube version of this, hopefully with my little preamble to start editing it out, or this morning's version. Often I use the afternoon version because I feel less supervised in the afternoon, and I tend to go off the rocker a little more. Good and bad. But anybody register, receive a copy of the slides. There should be a link, hopefully, with the high-risk RoHS table if you choose to download it. There should be a recording of this one or the mornings with some editing at the start. Probably available by Friday. If you have any questions, if I don't get your questions, I'm going to try to get your questions right. Please contact me afterwards and we'll try to get to it. Oh God, people are making comments. My little fryer tuck in the back. Yeah, I know. Well, right now it's pretty good. Pretty good right now. I'm not going to show back there and make examples. Scariest thing I'll write this week. I look forward to your webinars. That's great. There's a lot of work to prep. What is the sense of having exemptions to expire in August 2026? They need to have a renewal request by 2025, requiring those of us who need the exemption to request the renewal in just a few months. We won't have any information in addition to what has already been submitted in our socioeconomic assessment. The great thing, because of the law. Now, it's not your fault they dragged their heels for many, many years, but it's because of the way the law is structured. On the bright side, you don't have to have all the answers off the bat. I've done enough RoHS exemptions submissions in my time where you submit with good enough data, they'll request additional data for the consultation, and then you go, and you use that time in between to update the data. And you really want to justify that you've tried, or somebody's tried the alternatives and why it doesn't work. But yeah, so the initial application doesn't have to be complete. And it might be nothing new, because in a lot of times you might be renewing the same data. They might be reinforcing it. So we might put together a small consortium for the more complex product manufacturers. The component guys are definitely welcome to keep up to speed on this. And their challenge, it's not like they have to replace, they're the maker of the resistor that's replaced. They have this complicated product with all of its qualifications that the part's in. So it's a little bit different. When will this updated exemption information be posted on the EC website? Well, it has to be published to the official journal, which I'm guessing, I guess May. That's my swag, but it might be March. Might be a little bit earlier. All the exemptions are tracked on the European Commission's website on an Excel sheet with formulas. Yeah. So if RoHS became a regulation, which it's not, it'll be controlled by the European Chemical Agency and a little more like the REACH SVHC and REACH restriction structure. It's not right now. It's on an Excel sheet on the EC website. Some people looked up Peter Ostrom and IMDb. Yeah, he retired to be a veterinarian in upstate New York. All these splits and exemptions require more work for us with no perceivable benefit to the environment. Why? Because the law mandates, so you're allowed these exemptions as long as they follow the law. The law mandates that they have to continue to reduce the number of exemptions or the scope. Now, sometimes the scope, like 7C1, is like lead and glass, and now it's lead and glass in these specific applications, which is actually what the 7C1 is being used for. But it causes refinement, and as they refine, like lead and machined aluminum, then they have to say, okay, now we're just doing for machined aluminum. Now show me why it's needed for machined aluminum. It forces more pressure to actually create change where change can be done. Are military parts exempt for high temp solder? So if you're not in scope of RoHS, you're not in scope of this. So you get to your own thing. So parts intended for national security, again, are not in scope of RoHS, and none of this stuff applies to them. As a manufacturer of electronic items that rely on exemption 7A and 7C1, should I be relying on the component manufacturers to be applying for these renewal? For the most part, yes, because it's really their level, unless sometimes you have your own unique uses of 7C1. That's a little bit different. Like you're using it for resistant element in an oxygen sensor in a medical device. It's a little more specific to you. So there's usually very specific ones, but generally with them, what we might do, and it's probably very expensive because it's not high maintenance, create a little consortium to monitor and keep you guys up to speed in the RoHS exemptions, and at the same time submit some comments to the exemptions that come up as more for the complex article manufacturers who are not directly related. So we can translate, this is what's going on, how it affects you, and at the same time provide some feedback, not from the component people, but from the complex article people. Do component manufacturers already have declared the split exemption? That is, will we have to collect information from them before 2025? If the part's compliant, you don't have to collect anything from them. You can choose to, and they probably won't have things up to date until June-ish. Might be earlier, but you don't have, and they're not published yet, so they don't have to have an update. Some of the guys will probably have it up to date tomorrow. If you know the part type, so what we do, so anybody sign up for monthly or quarterly updates class, we actually go over, here are the exemptions where they're used. This is what it is now. So you can go regather all your thick film resistor 7C1 data, but it's 7C5. That's what it is. Just don't even bother. It's 7C5 now. So we make it a lot easier. We make scientific laboratory equipment. We use scientific laboratory equipment. We purchase components and assemble. Responsible test components, even the manufacturer supplies with RoHS certification. The RoHS compliant technical documentation at the finished product level, the brand owner. So yes, again, when we do scientific equipment, blood analyzers, laboratory mass, like compliance for mass specs, you don't have to test everything. That's one of the reasons why we test certain part types and a certain number of parts. And usually at the same time, like, really, we're doing the REACH restriction or REACH SVHC or PFAS update, and RoHS just piggybacks along. So it's pretty incremental. It's usually the easiest way to do compliance originally, and you don't have to do everything. Again, there's a risk assessment approach, which we help with. And we get a super complicated products, like we've got 5,000, 10,000 parts in our product. Awesome, we're not testing 5,000, 10,000 parts. 500 max is probably less. For China RoHS, and 500 isn't like, oh my God, it's gonna take forever. No, it's days of main testing. Now there's some tests that take a little bit longer, but it's mostly just wait time. So for China RoHS non-catalog products, we don't need an updated table of values until probably 2027. We're not sure yet. It has to be published. I'm guessing. I have 2026 as worst case. It might be 2027. We should get at least a year's warning before we have to update the tables. I put 2026 in these slides just to be a bit conservative, but 2027 is quite likely. When will the testing for high-risk parts of RoHS start actually being regulated, checked? When IEC 63000 is updated. And it'll be different in China. It'll be earlier in China than it is in the EU. IEC 63000 would have to be declared. It's when you have to update the standard in your declaration of conformity. So your single pager should say compliant to RoHS directive, and down below it should say using Technical standard IEC 63000 2016 or 2018, whichever it is. So when it gets updated to 2026 version or whichever it is, that's when you'll need to use it. It's when you update your declaration of conformity to the 2026. Now, EU is saying it's been there the whole time. We're enforcing like it should have been done the whole time, but it won't be in the standard till probably 2026. But we're going to enforce like it's been there the whole time because they're saying the law says it's been there. So we don't care what your tech. We want you to update the standard because it doesn't pass our law. What you have to be compliant to is our law. So it's there right now. Actually, do component manufacturers need to do the China RoHS table and China RoHS label? If it's going into China to be integrated into another product, no. If it's being sold in the Chinese market on the open market with no intended products, the components, yes. But if they're being integrated, no. What is the deadline for China RoHS testing? We don't have that yet because we're still in the consultation phase. 2027 probably at the earliest. I'm not 100% sure actually. How do we get a copy of the recording? Could you be more specific? Okay, so we have a YouTube channel. So it should, when we send out a mailer, there should be a link to the slides you'll get and to the YouTube channel. So there is a YouTube. When in doubt, just go Claigan YouTube and you'll find it. And it'll be there probably Friday. But the actual mailer link should have it too. Do you have a problem with me putting it on our internal network? No, this is public domain. The YouTube one is, you just put a link to it. YouTube we like because it's much more portable for everybody. It's not like this big, massive recording file of like gigabyte. It's much more portable. China RoHS update is testing for specific parts in the catalog products. Is the EU going to do the same thing? Yes, it already has it. It's in the standard 62321-2, that table we talked about. That's where we're doing an updated table. Because our updated table is more correct and less high risk inclusive. We're in the 2024 timeframe where we're like, resistors, they don't fail. You can test them, they're exempted, but they don't fail. All the power to you, but why bother? They don't fail. How about capacitors? They don't fail either. The board solder, yes, it can fail, but once you test board solder on a circuit board, you're fine. You don't have to keep retesting on that board. Do connectors fail? Yes, and here's some rules around that, and so on and so forth. So we're much more reasonable about it, especially when you got all these billion little surface mount components. Those billion little surface mount components, they don't fail. So don't bother, and that reduces your part count dramatically. Can your cable fail? Absolutely, and there's ways to handle it. And your heatsink fail? Nope, don't bother. So now for us, for reach SVHC, like silicone is basically low risk for RoHS. It doesn't fail, but it does always have an SVHC in it, just how much. So that's a little bit different. So great questions. Thanks to everybody who attended. Great questions, commentary. Hope you enjoyed the format. We're trying to make it a little more interactive, a little more animated so you can follow a little better. I do generally talk too fast. And my mother's not necessarily terribly impressed with that, but it's sometimes hard to stop. If I think and I talk at the same time, it tends to go a little quicker than I originally planned. But anyways, so the nice thing is the YouTube recording, will you be able to slow down. You'll be able to actually go to sections to YouTube automatically bookmarks different topics and makes your life hopefully a lot easier, and then you can slow it down. So thanks again for everybody attended. It was a super pleasure to host everyone again, and I look forward to talking to everyone again soon. And so this is the part of the recording I also want them normally to edit where I can't find where the buttons were to end the thing. And yeah, well, again, a pleasure. And I look forward to talking to everyone again soon.